Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to African Philosophy Conversations. It is my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Jonathan Chimakonam. He is an associate professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Previous to that, he was in Nigeria at University of Calabar. His teaching and research interests are everywhere, logic, African philosophy, comparative intercultural philosophy, ethics, philosophy of maths. I mean, it would be a shorter list to talk about what he doesn't write on than what he does write on. So it's a great pleasure to talk about somebody who's so widely published and thinks so broadly within African philosophy today. So welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Janz, for inviting me to this conversation in a literal sense, of course. I am glad to be here and for us to share ideas.
Yeah. Hopefully
that will be of benefit to our listeners and students.
Excellent. So I guess the place I like to start usually is, I guess, a little bit biographical. I'm interested in how people found their way into philosophy in general and into African philosophy in particular. So could you talk a little bit about your path?
Okay, this is also a subject I have talked about in some places, bridged them in a couple of my writings. And I'm happy to share that once again. I didn't find my way to philosophy by accident. I came into philosophy by pure choice. That has something to do, a lot to do with the background I had as a kid. I was already reading some of the books of the ancient philosophers, like Plato's Republic, for example, Homer's literary works, if you like, in my father's library. So I was well aware of, partly aware of some of these ideas of the ancient Greek philosophers and their Egyptian counterparts. And I can say that I was enthused quite early with their thinking, and I was enamored to philosophy, so to speak, quite early. However, I didn't know what it was as a discipline, and it didn't really occur to me that it is something that one can really choose to study at the university until my second year in the secondary school, when it was a career day. My school usually hosts that every year, bring people from different walks of life to talk to students to help them make a choice of what they'd like to be in the future. And a philosopher was amongst those that came in my second year in secondary school. And I said, yes, I love this. However, I guess at some point that impression faded away amidst the noise of being a lawyer, come from the family of lawyers. And at some point, they began to tip me to be the next in line to take such a mantle. And it began to, interest me. I would even make a drawing of myself wearing the lawyer's wig and all kinds of things in my notebook in secondary school. Until my fifth year in the secondary school, when another philosopher was amongst those that was invited to speak to us on that career day. On that eventful day, I knew I was going to be a philosopher. I decided that that was what I was going to be. And I never wavered. But finding my way to African philosophy is a different story altogether. I had African philosophy courses, preliminary introductions, and some other engagements while I was doing my undergrads. But it wasn't until I found my way to the University of Calabar when that interest really blossomed. Meeting the likes of Innocent Asuzu and Chris Ijoma, as well as Godfrey Zumba and their works, really rekindled that interest, even though at that time I was already on the path of logic for my master's and doctorate, but I was also reading African philosophy seriously. I knew I was going to specialize in that field eventually. And of course, when I left school and making presentations here and there in Nigerian philosophical community, and logic wasn't that so much something that many people cherish to listen to and all that, and wrote a few articles that few people paid attention to. I guess at that moment I I had to devote more attention. I started devoting more attention to African philosophy, and it has.
So you mentioned, you were just reading some articles and books, I guess. What were you reading? Do you remember what you were reading early on in African philosophy that caught your interest?
Yes, I do actually. Because I was interested in logic, Merad Hepgar was his article on logic was one of those I read quite early. I also read the volume edited by Senator Serwabahan that contains quite a number of interesting articles. Read the volume by a couple of articles in the volume by Emmanuel Leslie, and there's other volume edited by Peter Bordering. I read a couple of articles there, and of course, that article edited by Richard Wright, the book edited by Richard Wright. I read quite a couple of articles there as well. So the interest was building, but that was works outside the University of Calabar. Within the University of Calabar, the works of Asuzu, Ijoma, and Ozumba were, of course, something that you really had to read if you want to be properly baptized in the school, the Calabar school, so to speak. So it was very fun time, and as I narrate this, I have this sense of nostalgia once again.
Well, and my sense of Calabar, and I've only been there once, thanks to you actually, for a conference. My sense is that it's such a vibrant, philosophical community there. But, I'm also aware in the history of Nigeria of quite a number of vibrant philosophical communities. I mean, why do you think this is? I mean, I know Nigeria is the largest country in Africa by population. So is it just a matter of population, or is there something else that you would say also kind of contributes to this, rich philosophical kind of conversation going on?
Actually, this is a subject that I've been reflecting quite on recently, as I put together a book I am co-authoring with someone on critical historiography of African philosophy, something like that. I can't remember the title specifically. I think part of what positioned Nigeria, so to speak, to represent African philosophy and philosophy generally the way it does right now, quite for some time now, it's because a number of people who had studied philosophy elsewhere and returning to Nigeria. Of course, Nigerians are very proud people, and they want to control the narrative. Quite a number of them weren't so happy with the story of philosophy that they were given where they studied philosophy, and they wanted to change that. And there's always something that happens when there is this type of clarion call, gather everyone, let us defend our fortress, something like that. I think that was what happened, and you saw the resurgence of these reflexive activities in centers like the University of Ibadan, University of Nigeria in the East, Bafemi Awolowo University, where you have Shodipo and the rest of them, Peter Bodrin, of course, at Ibadan, and Sugula and the rest of them. At Nsukka, you have Onyenwe, Yusibi Okolo, quite a number of them. So these were really the early centers of philosophy in Nigeria. And it was, to my understanding, I haven't really finished that research. These people wanted to show that, all right, we've studied philosophy, we are back here to teach philosophy, and it is a discipline, set of skills, what's imparting on people and all that. But however, there's a way we can do this. And it wasn't so far from that when the great debates eventually materialized. And you can see that in the direction of thinking and approach to philosophy that these different characters and these schools are demonstrated, so to speak. So Calabar wasn't even there at the beginning as amongst the first centers of, it was amongst the second centers when University of Lagos and then eventually University of Calabar. And that was because the interest, those who made those other universities tick they started retiring, some of them started dying, and there was a dwindling tempo of philosophy in those other centers. And Calabar represented a new center with a new energy, especially when the likes of Azumezu and Chris Ijoma returned with their brand of philosophy that was completely different from what was done in other places. So it was as if Calabar overtook and started being at the forefront of advancing the cause of philosophy and African philosophy in Nigeria.
I mean, I can tell you my introduction to Nigerian philosophy, and, I really started looking at African philosophy. I mean, Emmanuel Eze was my first, the first person who really kind of brought me into the field at all, under some protest, I should say, because I kept telling him, I'm a white Canadian. What the hell do I know about, African philosophy? And yet the more we talked, the more we realized that there were interesting kind of overlaps, especially around questions of place and things like that. And so, in some ways I blame Emmanuel for much of my career, but but actually the people that I was reading early, and you might think it was Barry Hallen and J.O. Sotopo, who's, they were the introduction for many people to Nigerian philosophy, I think. And justly so. I mean, I think their work is really interesting, but the one that was of interest to me was Theophilus Ocare. And maybe as part of my background, because I'd worked in hermeneutics, and here was this guy, I mean, what I was used to in looking at African philosophy was the Anglophone world followed more or less the British path of analytic philosophy, and the Francophone world more or less followed the kind of continental path. And so I expected to talk about hermeneutics in the Francophone work, but not in the Anglophone. And here's this guy, writing about hermeneutics in what was essentially an Anglophone tradition. And I thought, this is really amazing. And, and so he was the first person who I thought, there's something interesting going on here that's not just about, if you wish, traditionalism, or let's kind of go pre-colonial and figure out what the kind of deep roots are, or something like that. This was something that felt very current to me. So,
perhaps that's a reason why Theophilus Ocare also went into the direction. We can argue that he was probably influenced by philosophies from the French-speaking world. I think he had some form of contact with University of Leuven in Belgium and then Rome. Perhaps that's a way this influence got to him and all that. But hey, besides, as at that time, it was Okunda Okolo, who is also from the French-speaking angles. Those are the people who were really introducing hermeneutics to African philosophy. Before Ocare did that, I think the magic of Ocare's, the magic touch that he had on that subject was also somewhat reliant on his cultural background and worldview. And he looks at it, and he looks at what people are doing in hermeneutics, and he said, hey, perhaps there are dimensions from my cultural perspective that are not really covered in what you guys are doing, and which I think hermeneuticians world over might be interested in. It's something that could enrich the discourse on hermeneutics. And he offered us that quite important text in African philosophy covering that hermeneutical angle, and we're all happy for that. All those things have come to enrich the discourse called African philosophy today.
Yeah, and I like the way you put that, because I mean, every African country is culturally rich, but Nigeria is especially culturally rich. I mean, if somebody just thinks that, Nigeria is reducible to one of the major, people groups like Yoruba or Igbo or something like that, they're sadly mistaken, right? I mean, there's such, cultural, linguistic, diversity.
Diversity.
And so, but one thing that strikes me and that's interesting is that there's also, it feels to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like there's a kind of tendency towards kind of the building of large systems, that take into account many, many different kinds of questions in philosophy. Like Innocent Azumezu, who you've talked about, or there are other examples that we could give, and maybe even conversationalism we could put in that category too. I don't know. But is there a sense that philosophy is a kind of systemic sort of an enterprise, as opposed to, let's say, focusing on very specific problems and analyzing those specific problems in isolation from other things?
Okay, so it's important for us to understand the background of philosophy, and specifically African philosophy in the Nigerian setting, and why the need for system building arose in the first place. It's all part of a strategy to control the narrative. Look, if I feel that I've got something philosophical to say, if I think that my culture harbors rich reservoir of philosophical ideas, and I wish to communicate it to the world, I don't just start expressing those ideas. There are certain things that serve as a kind of a structure, framework for philosophy. And then you have to have that sort of framework to communicate your ideas through that framework. Now, you have a choice here. Either you try to communicate those ideas using the framework of Western philosophy already established, or you try to construct such a framework so that your ideas will, you channel your idea, you push them through that framework. And this really is something that different philosophers from Nigeria and even those who are building systems thought about and made their choices. For one thing, it's not easy to build structures. It's not easy to build a system that organizes ideas and shapes the structure of thought. It's not easy. It's one of the most difficult things to do in the intellectual realm. So now you see many people who actually latch onto philosophical structure that was given to them from the West, and then they try to communicate African philosophy through that. And then you have, and this is specific, this is has been most pronounced in the contributions of the Calabar school. They want to create their own structure because they have doubts that the structure of Western philosophy will be able to carry forth the message of African philosophy. And because of this, and this is something that my research has tried to engage with in the last couple of years. Because if you say, for example, that reason is universal, exactly what do you mean? Exactly what do you mean? That reason functions in a system, follows a pattern, a structure. And if you try to communicate the message of African philosophy using that structure that could have been set up in the West, influenced by Western cultural worldviews, how are you sure that the Western cultural worldview that lies at the foundation of that structure would not, if not contaminate, but distort the message you want to put forward, such that at the end of the day, it would be difficult to say that this is African philosophy. I recall what Jordan Hengelbrock said when he encountered Hotonji at his visit in Africa. All right, it bemoans the fact that he couldn't see the Africa that everybody talks about. He looks left and right and he says all he sees Western life forms in the lifestyle in their worst forms, you know. And then he questions Hotonji to tell him where Africa is, and spontaneously Hotonji says, in our hearts. You know, that's not where we want to be. We don't want to accept that. Those of us from the Calabar school, we want to right that wrong. We know that this structure, there's nothing wrong with that structure, but it is influenced by the Western cultural worldview. And we need our own structure that can effectively carry the African philosophical message across. And that's that is part of what distinguishes the Calabar school from the rest, so to speak.
Well, and I'd like to pick up on something you just mentioned, which was the idea of reason. You used the example of reason, and I was hoping to move in that direction in our conversation, because you've written extensively on the nature of reason. And I think it's, you know, within the context of ways that reason has been treated in maybe the last 100 or so years in the history of Africa, of African thought, and not just African thought, but the way that Africa has been regarded by the rest of the world. I mean, there's this classic idea that, in the West, Hegel represents this and many others do too, that Africa is not capable of reason, right? Anything that's in Africa had to be brought there by someone else because intrinsically it's just not there. And so you get, the next step in that story in a certain sense is maybe something like, negritude, where you get this notion that, well, maybe there's two kinds of reason, right? There's the discursive reason that's over there, and there's the emotional reason that's over here. And maybe that fixes the problem. And nobody really likes that answer very much.
Yeah, nobody does.
No, and so, but it's been a kind of perennially interesting question to think about how reason works, because our intuition is that it's always got to be a kind of universal aptitude or universal sort of thing. This is what humans do, right? And yet, right, and you've been talking about kind of an African approach, even a Calabar approach to thinking about reason. So can you elaborate a little bit on how reason fits into all of this? Is there, maybe this is just a classic, universal versus particular debate, but is there a way past that? Is there a way maybe that those two options are not our only options on reason?
Okay, first, let me begin by saying that folks like Hegel and Kant were eminently ignorant of some of the subjects they try to speak on with some authority.
Right.
Well, okay, so philosophers generally would want to think of reason as a tool. This is the tool, the most important tool in our toolbox for doing philosophy. In the sense that we think, we argue, we put our thoughts through some measured framework system to ensure that inconsistencies and contradictions and what have you. Okay, those are fine. So you need reason, even as a human faculty, to engage in philosophy. Now that's fine. And because of how the period of enlightenment morphed to modernity, and the logic that really grounds these master tropes, there's this impression that when you talk about philosophy, then you're talking about one philosophy. And then, since reason is the ultimate tool for philosophy, it is also one reason. And there's no doubt about that. I don't disagree with that. And elements of the Calabar school don't actually disagree with that. What we say, in essence, is this: that reason is not some item in the market shelf there that you can go and pick up and say, hello, everybody, this is reason. This is what you have to emulate before you can do philosophy. That's not what it is. Reason is part of what makes us human. The expression of that in certain ways gives us what we call philosophy. And that is why even non-philosophers tap into it to express themselves in their diverse fields. What we say in the Calabar school, however, is that reason is always in a journey, constantly in a journey, and manifesting itself in different cultural worldviews. It is the same reason, but with several manifestations in different cultural worldviews. And the extent of development of that reason that you might find in one culture might not be exactly the same as you find in another culture, but it is the same reason. And the structure of that reason, as you may find in one cultural worldview, may not be the same as you will find in another worldview, but it is the same reason. The important thing is for us to give room to appreciate the many colors of reason as they manifest from different cultural worldviews and cultural backgrounds. And it is the structure and the extent of manifestation of reason in a particular cultural worldview that shapes their philosophy. Because, for example, reason is always quick to engage and raise questions about issues and problems of life. If, for example, you have a context, a cultural worldview in Europe, perturbed by certain problems like climate change, like extreme cold, lack of basic resources, reason is going to raise questions to address those problems there. Now, if you come to another context in Africa with a different set of problems, reason will manifest there to raise questions that can challenge those problems that emerge there. Now, if after 100 or 200 or 300 years of successful implementation of reasons manifestation in a particular cultural area, and then they go ahead to universalize that very manifestation, thereby writing off. Because once you draw that logical line, and by logical line, I mean the Aristotelian type, you promote one side and then you residualize the other side, ultimately in classical two-value propositional logic. And then they do that and write off whatever happens elsewhere. It is not just bad for African philosophy and Africans, it is bad for everyone, because the advance of humanity is a collective thing now, and the progress we make, especially at the intellectual realm, is something that affects everyone, in every part of the world. So if you promote a system that promotes one particular cultural manifestation and thereby repressing other various cultural manifestations, you rob the world of immense knowledge reservoir that could solve a lot of problems everywhere. And that is it. And that is why in the Calabar School, and indeed in different other places in Africa, when people are putting forward different theories, trying to agglutinate different ways of solving different problems that may rival what you have from Western intellectual space, it is not that these things are not good enough. It is just because those who control the resources to create, produce knowledge, control knowledge, regulate knowledge, and disseminate knowledge have made it in such a way that those other ideas are repressed. And it is the world that lose eventually. Yeah. And those of us in the Calabar School wouldn't have it.
Right. Well, I mean, I've got about a dozen questions here, so thank you for that. You know, I want in a moment for you to talk a little bit about your most recent book, which is on Azumezu Logic, which is, kind of implied with everything you just said there. But I'm interested in what happens at that moment of encounter of, the different contexts of reason. I mean, there are a number of things that could happen. I mean, it could be a dialectical process, right? I mean, we just took shots at Hegel, and rightly so. But his answer to that is that when difference comes together, then there's something transcended, and people or history or whatever moves forward. He's obviously not the only voice in saying what happens when things come together. But I guess my first question to you is, what happens when we actually do establish that Western forms of reason are not universal the way they've claimed for themselves, but are very much tied to their places, are very much tied to the questions that they've asked, the situations out of which they came. African questions have a different context, have a different history. So I'm interested in what happens when that encounter happens. Basically what you just described. What does the Calabar School, or what do you think? How do you imagine that different forms of reason operate with each other?
Okay, reason is not at war with itself.
Okay.
Like I said, reason is reason everywhere. It just happens to manifest differently in a different place, but it's not at war with itself. Okay, which is what the principle of non-contradiction somehow tries to, impress it on us that reason at some point could be at war with itself. It's never at war with itself. What happens when seemingly opposed variables, okay, different manifestations of reasons come together, is that granted the fact that these manifestations might be different, granted also that each of these manifestations might be valid in themselves, okay, contradiction is not the only thing that can happen. All right. In fact, the Calabar School wants to create the impression that the goal should be to transcend contradiction. All right. It is not a wall that we cannot pass. as we assume. It's not a world that we cannot negotiate past. It's a higher goal, and that goal is complementation. All right. Now, why do we think of complementation as superior? Well, let me not use the word superior, but as much more desirable than contradiction. It is because, as I try to explain it in my articulation of the conversation, thinking that there is these foundational principles of the universe. Number one is the principle of insufficiency, and then the principle of self-preservation. All right, because we are all self-insufficient, we need others to complement us. All right, and think of opposed variables in that way. Every variable, no matter its strength and no matter its reach, is not complete and cannot, as a result, be absolute or regarded as such. There's always something it misses. There's always something it lacks, and which another variable that might be opposed to it is in a better position to offer. All right. So instead of thinking about these two opposed variables as their relationship as something that something that must end at one, falling down, and at the other standing, remaining standing, we can think of it as a win-win situation where both of them complement each other in ways that they are insufficient. And also uses his principle of missing link to explain that. All right. I formulated the ontological thesis that states that each unit of variable is autonomous in itself. All right. However, it exists in a network with other variables. Okay. Because even though it is autonomous, it is still self-insufficient. And it becomes necessary for it to maintain that relationship. And that is why the three cardinal foundational principles I have articulated to say that for any theory to be the ultimate criteria to judge any theory to be African philosophy, the first one is relationality, that states that all the variables necessarily interrelate. The second one is contextuality, that states that such relationships occur in context. And the third one is complementarity, that the goal of such relationships that occur in context is for these seemingly opposed variables to actually complement each other. So something that happens when seemingly opposed variables or reasons from different contexts meet is a much more desirable outcome, which would be an attempt to complement or to achieve complementation. You know, and that is actually how the world works. All right, when people have contracts and they're negotiating, people are warring in different places, and at some point they come together.
Right.
They see that the principle of non-contradiction is not usually a successful one, and they come together to dialogue. And they call it dialogue, and call it polylogue, like Franz Weber. And you call it dialogue, and a couple of other people and all that. You know, we call it complementarity.
But, you know, there's a lot of pitfalls with dialogue, too. I mean, we can use dialogue as a weapon. I mean, I see that happen when people say, let's keep talking, when talking is a substitute for acting, you know, and what's really needed is action, you know.
Yes, dialogue can be weaponized. And I think I've said that in one of my writings, if not two. Because, you have to say who determines the structure of that dialogue, who calls for it, who sets out the rules of that engagement. And to what end? What are the weaknesses that one party or the other in that dialogue has that could count against them or weaken their position? Who holds the S's in such dialogues? And conversational thinking, we hesitate to use the word dialogue. We prefer to use the word conversation, articulated in its technical sense. And in that sense, we have a principle we call creative struggle, all right? The making conversation a process of creative struggle geared towards meaning making. Now, it is creative in the sense that the goal is to better something new and better. It is a struggle because the entities who are in that conversation, one San, one Joe, they have their own interests. They are seemingly opposed. Okay, so you can write off those differences. You can, again, wish away their peculiar identities as you strive to bring them into conversation. Right. It sort of creates some form of functional diversity. So it's important that their identities are respected, even in that collective ritual. Is very important. And all these things are going to create tension, a lot of tension. But then, if the principles of these of conversation are adhered to, it's always a chance that the tensions would be, they will wriggle through the tension to achieve the goal of complementing each other. And in real life, that's what we want to happen in real life, in our workplaces. We don't have to be friends with our colleagues to work with them, right, but we can respect them and work with them effectively. You know, and those are the things. So conversation enables us to overcome some of the weaknesses in dialogue by imbuing itself with some other relevant principles that ensures that differences are recognized, not as signs of inferiority, but as diversity, and diversity is beautiful.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. You know, what strikes me as I hear you describe this is you know, there's a certain kind of walking on a parallel path with you know, somebody I've mentioned already, which is Emmanuel Eze. You know, his last book On Reason, which was published in, well, it was published posthumously. He died at the end of 2008, I believe it was, or 7, something like that. Yeah, and so I think it came out in 08. And it was a really, you know, I mean, Emmanuel was a very, very sharp thinker, you know, at any time, but certainly I thought this book was interesting for how it shifted the conversation about reason within the context of African philosophy. I mean, what you never saw him say, here's an African approach to reason. What you saw him say, like he de-linked that notion that reason is somehow culturally located. And instead he said, here are all these ways that all of us reason. We use logical reason. We use hermeneutical reason. We use phenomenological. We use what he called ordinary reason, all of these different things. And then you've got this thing called rationality, which in a certain sense is the organizing function. And that may appear differently depending on the context, depending on the background, the language, the whatever. And I thought it was a really, you know, interesting kind of approach to the conversation, informed by, you know, the challenges to reason within African philosophy in the past, but a kind of a step forward. And so it feels a little bit like he's kind of a, you know, walking in parallel. I mean, there's certain things that you're talking about that he doesn't get into at all, like, you know, the nature of conversation itself, for example. But it feels like there's that respect for diversity of thinking, and also the recognition that reason is in fact a universal thing among humans.
Yeah, of course, that is correct. And Emmanuel wants to do something that Senghor should have done. And even though people criticize Senghor for his distinction between the European reason and the African reason being emotional and what have you, I think it's more of a problem is about not articulating what he has in mind clearly. When I read Senghor, I know that what I have said and what members of the Calabar school are saying about reason was what he had in mind. But literature in African philosophy hadn't developed as it has today during that period. So he probably used the wrong set of words, and his major pitfall being the construction of that division. And Emmanuel Eze tried to return us to the basics, to taking a historical movement of the development and the discussion on reason from the ancients to the modern time, and trying to let us know how we all do the same thing, but in different ways. And the Calabar school approach is to say that reason is the same, but it manifests differently at different places. Because, hey, before you want to engage in reflection, for example, something inspires you, something instigates you, something stings you to do that. And those are the peculiar circumstances around you. All right. And once they do, you spontaneously come up with these set of questions that respond to those environmental challenges and all that. And someone in another place who has different circumstances would be stunned to respond, generate different questions and respond to. So these are different manifestations of reason. It doesn't mean that they are different types of reason. No, it's the same reason manifesting differently, structured by the peculiar circumstances that we find ourselves in, and which makes us a higher class animals, because more than other classes of animals, we can really instrumentalize reason as well as weaponize it, however we choose. But those are the things that we should be talking about, how people represent, how reason manifests in different places, not how many types of reason there are. Because at that point, it becomes difficult to wrap one's mind around the discussion.
Right.
Okay, if I need reason to engage in this discussion as you do, and we are from different places, and we say that there are different types of reasons, then the question is, how can we ever converse if our reasons are different?
Right.
We can't. We can make meaning out of what we discuss if we do not represent the same frame of reason.
Yeah.
I am, however, wary of the word universal and objective. I am particularly sensitive to these words because they have been weaponized in the literature, and eminently so.
Yeah.
So it is, and Cedric Weberhan and even yourself have spoken about the pretensions of Western philosophy and the rest of them. So I'm always wary of these words, because in as much as I do not want to agree to the weaponization of these words, I would also not want to be misquoted for the way I have used these words.
So I'm interested in how all of this would work turning towards, let's say, tradition. I mean, for some people, there is a sense that, the real African philosophy, whatever that means, resides in, pre-colonial, thought structures or intellectual structures, perhaps, people point to Ifa, tradition within Yoruba, that people point to a lot of different things and see that as being a kind of certainly highly developed, and I would certainly agree with that, or maybe like, for example, Egyptian thought or whatever, very highly developed thought systems. So how do you, given what you've just described about reason, how does reason turn towards that kind of tradition? Is there a kind of authenticity in that tradition, or is it simply another way that reason can draw on its own resources in a place, or how do you deal with that?
Okay, so when we talk about these cultural corpuses everywhere, we must understand that they are fodder for reason. Okay, they constitute fodder for reason. Everyone, and in different places of the world, you have the cultural worldviews of peoples. Okay, would it be wrong to describe all these things as philosophies? The answer is yes, because at that point it will be difficult for us to distinguish philosophy from sociology, from anthropology, and from other ethnographic studies and what have you. So philosophy happens when reason encounters ideas in different forms, cultural corpuses, experiences, and what have you, in a particular order way. All right. When there is no such order, but reasoning, there's such an encounter, we can describe that philosophy that occurs as unsystematic. All right. But when there is order, and by that order I mean a framework, a methodology, that really enables us to shape our ideas and put them out there in a particular structure so that other people can engage, agree to disagree, and what have you. And reason will continue to turn out new ideas from such engagement. Now, when that happens, then philosophy occurs. And you ask a question, when does African philosophy occur? When people count their fingers and recall some folklores and stories and recount stories, ancient and what have you, and say this is the real African philosophy. No, that's not true. That's the real African culture. Real African cultural worldview. Those are the authentic African cultural corpuses, not African philosophy. For African philosophy to occur, there's got to be an encounter. We've got to raise questions. That's where we begin when we want to philosophize. And then we begin to, depending on the structure that has been laid and during the systematization of that discipline, begin to engage with the questions we have raised. And that is why I'm of the view that those who worked in the field, the vineyard of African philosophy in the 20th century left the foundations and started building the roofs and all that. The castles are, yeah, the castle is going to be in the air. That's where it's supposed to be. But without a foundation, the castle will not last. It will not stand. All right. So I am of the opinion that the debate on African philosophy and all those things ought to have started with the foundation of African philosophy. We want to build African philosophy. What will constitute the foundation? And I believe that quite a number of things, but again, I created the pyramid structure and I said at the foundation should be logic and ontology. All right, logic dealing with the laws governing thoughts, and ontology dealing with the realities that are shuffled in that reasoning process. Okay, these are the two things that should be at the foundation. In fact, in one of my very first engagement with this matter, I pointed out logic and placed ontology next to logic. But one of my students wrote a counter paper where he argued that it is ontology rather than logic. Okay, whereas I do not agree with him, his paper shed some light on my view, enabling me to readjust them a bit by bringing ontology down to be at the same platform with logic. And I was able to get something that really fulfills what I had in mind. And I am talking of my former student, Lucky Bonaya, who wrote that very exciting paper. So now, we did not do this in African philosophy. People were just arguing, there is African philosophy, there is an African philosophy, we can reason in Africa, this and therefore we have African philosophy. All these things are like old wives' chatter, pardon me for that. But hey, as important as that era was in sustaining the discussion till this time, they missed the point, they missed what they ought to have done. What should be the foundation of African philosophy we want to build? And then when you have the foundation, then you talk about the method. What should be the methods that we can formulate to do this philosophy, to deliver? Methods are like the implements that delivers the final thing. What methods can we articulate based on that foundation, from that foundation? They did not engage with all of this. And then it is from method, that you now begin to talk about the actual theorizings in different ways and all that, which are organizations of ideas in line with different methods and what have you. So when you miss all this structure and you're talking of African philosophy, you end up doing African philosophy, organizing ideas of African philosophy along one Western formulated method or the other, based on the foundation, logical and ontological foundation of Western philosophy. Now, how do you call that philosophy? I give you an example before I end with this question. If you look at the works that these people have written, his colleagues, ancient and 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and currently, they begin from a foundation that is completely based on two-valued logic. And then by the time they are making their so-called African powerful proposal, they are making a proposal that tilts towards complementation. That's no longer two-valued logic. And two-valued logic cannot accommodate that. The only thing I can come with it is a variant of three-value logic, which I have formulated. One of them is Azumezu Logic. Innocent Asuzu has his complementary logic, and Chris Ijoma has harmonious monism, as the case may be. So now, and these things get accepted and published in different powerful presses in the West, because that's what they want to hear. Okay, right. That's what they want to hear. But again, when you study the logical structure of what has been put forward, you discover that it's a disaster. You began with two-value logic and you end with three-value logic. That's a mother of all inconsistencies. And many literature, including those put forward by very respected African philosophers, fall into this great mistake, that cement the foundation of distortion and misrepresentation of African philosophy, to which some of them now cry, about when some Western philosophers engage and publish this, and they cry foul, whereas they're also guilty of the same thing. And these are the things that the conversational school aim to remedy. That's what makes us unique, because we've taken time to study the problem, and we are trying to address them the best we can, and where we believe is the best, so that the real African idea is put out there without distortions and misrepresentations.
Well, thank you for a very kind of clear kind of articulation of how all of that works. I guess we're running out of time here, so I don't want to keep you any longer than necessary. But I am finally interested in the end of how you interest students in African philosophy. I mean, is there a reading you give them? Is there a concept that you try and talk about that kind of helps them, the way it happened for you, all of a sudden, I get it, now I get why this is important. How do you try and do that for students coming up?
Great. In the Calabar school, we always start from the premises of introducing students to some of the literatures out there. I am drawing the attention to the fact that there are things that are wrong with this literature. And then we try to create a scenario to explain that with their own real life experiences as Africans. And they discover that immediately there's a difference between the Western philosophy that they study in school, where they try to master what Parmenides said, what Kant has said, and they try to master all of that in order to pass their examinations without really having that sort of natural understanding of those precepts, because the cultural worldview that lie at the foundation of these ideas are remarkably different from what they are used to, and so it's always difficult for them to ground these things to real life experiences. But when we come from our premises, take for example Innocent Asuzu's philosophy, and he tries to explain how these things work, and they realize that, hey, this is what we do. This is how we lead our lives. This is what I experience every day in my village, amongst my people. It is in our song. It's in our cultural norms and all kinds of values and what have you. At that moment, philosophy ceases to be one abstract thing out there that's not meant for human beings. It becomes an integral part of whom he is as a human being in this world, as a member of a certain community or society or cultural worldview. And that offers them a remarkable advantage to produce new ideas, to understand the philosophy and ideas that have been shared, and even to understand the philosophy of the West and the East and different places. Because once you have a standpoint, once you have a place to stand, you'll be able to see others better. You'll be able to see clearer. You'll be able to understand yourself better. And that's what happens at the Calabar school. At the risk of sounding immodest, when you take a look at the products that emerge from the Calabar school and the sort of things they write, and you read it, you see remarkable originality. You see creativity. You see something that can actually work if transformed into policy initiative. Unlike what others write everywhere and all that, trying to master a certain structure in the West that really they have little or no intimate connection with, and so that is it. That is why the Calabar School, I believe is the best thing to have happened to African philosophy, and still represents the future of African philosophy. A time will come when all these people who, unfortunately, it's not that that's what they plan to, but because of their training, they go about transliterating Western philosophy. If a certain theory has been exhausted in Western philosophy, somebody goes to pick it and comes to look for an African variant of that theory, and then publishes articles and books and all that, further terrorizing, even his African students with such ignorance. And when they realize that, look, they are not on the right path, it's difficult to retrace their steps because their formation had already cast their destiny in steel. Okay, so we want to encourage African philosophers, Africans, especially at home and in diaspora, to attune themselves to the right trajectory of African philosophy, so that tomorrow no one will accuse them or ask them questions that they cannot answer. When you ask these people a simple question about methodology, they falter. When you ask them a simple question about the logic underlying their thoughts, they can hold their beats together. Interestingly, these are the professors and teachers of African philosophy. I think that is the great tragedy that has happened in different universities on the continent. I am not so much worried about what happens in Europe and other places where they teach African philosophy, but it shouldn't happen here on the continent. Where the clear Oderoruka in his 1975 paper talks about being versed in African intellectual life world and culture before you should talk about African philosophy. And you see, these Africans abandon African intellectual life world and culture and then try to embrace and understand and assimilate the Western structure and then impose that in the African philosophical treatises and ideas they try to publish and create, thereby miseducating future Africans and African philosophers. Unfortunately, these people are in majority. And they wield enormous influence, and European and North American funders like to work with these people because they say things that they understand. Why? Because they are using the methodology and logic of the logic that underlies Western philosophy. It is time that we make a choice, even those in Europe and North America, to choose what we want to promote. Do we want to promote ideas and publish books and articles that 10, 20 years from now will be exposed for the shams that they really are, or what? Because it will surely happen. Innocent Asuzu saw this long ago, and he said that in 30, 50 years from now, some of these things that they put out there will become a story of the past, and it is the Calabar School will encourage our students to do the right thing, get it right from the foundation, and you will understand what African philosophy is. If you ask all these people, what makes a discourse African? He said, simple but a very tough question that they cannot answer. You ask them, what makes this article you have written on this subject African? They will go to the peripherals. They talk about how they are talking about African design. Those are peripherals. Those are not the core. Those, you need to strike the method and foundation that hosts, that carries the flesh itself. So those are the things. African philosophy is a beautiful thing, and we want to continue to develop it in the right direction. And we encourage people like you who have done very important works in African philosophy. I like your work, and it is inspired a lot of my works eminently, because you raise questions that should be raised, questions that many African philosophers today are still not raising, and are still not addressing. Until you do that, you will not get the clear trajectory of where you're going to. And in the book I'm writing now, I hope you will see that I addressed most of those questions. Thank you.
I look forward to seeing that book. Thank you so much, Dr. Jonathan Chimakonam, for this wonderful conversation today. You make me optimistic for the future of African philosophy, and that's a really great thing. So thank you
you.
everyone for joining us today on African Philosophy Conversations, and see you again next time.
Thank you very much.